How do we hear God's voice? I'm going to propose there's at least three things that we do in our normal, ordinary way of life, and perhaps those three things help correspond to helping us hear in the spiritual life, our soul in relation to God. Okay, so in our normal, ordinary course of life, there's at least three things that we always do in order to really listen and to hear other people speak. And so those three things are this. First, we need to have like a real, authentic desire to listen. There's no real listening or hearing of anyone's voice if we don't actually have a real authentic desire. Second, sometimes we need to remove certain obstacles to be able to hear and to hear better. And third, we need to put ourselves in a close proximity to actually hearing people. Sometimes we're at a far distance or there's things in the way, so we need to place ourselves into close proximity. Those are the three things. So a little bit on the normal ordinariness of those three things. So with a real authentic desire to hear anyone, we're probably used to the fact that people can speak to us and we can choose not to listen. We can suppress it. We can pretend that we don't listen. There's a host of ways in which someone could actually be speaking to us, but however it comes about, we can choose not to listen. And so if we actually desire to hear God, we have to have a real authentic desire. And I'll give you a little test question. How do I actually know if I have a real authentic desire to hear God? Well, let me tell you this, or ask you this. Are you listening and seeking to be obedient to what God has already said? That is the authenticating measure of if we truly desire to hear God's voice. So, if we want to hear God's voice, plenty of people have like wishful thinking, like, oh, I wish God would speak to me. But the areas in which God has already spoken in their life, and especially through the church, God has always been speaking through the church. The Ten Commandments, the moral life, the wisdom of the church, the sacraments. But if we don't have any real intention of being obedient to listening to any of those areas, well, then do we really have an authentic desire to hear God speak to us in anything new? So that's the authenticating measure. And if I have a real authentic desire to hear God, it will be authenticated by a certain willingness to listen and to obey to what God has already said and what He is already saying in the life of the church. Okay, second aspect to hearing God's voice is sometimes we need to remove obstacles. I know it might sound kind of gross, but plenty of people have to go to like an ear, nose, and throat doctor, and sometimes they have to go through periodic ear cleaning. That sounds really gross, but it's true. Some people have to regularly go to get their wax buildup removed in their ears to be able to hear better. Our hearing can easily be reduced by 5%, 55%, sometimes a near total eclipse of our capacity to hear simply because there's a wax buildup in our ear canal. And perhaps there's something deeply important that corresponds in the life of our soul to hearing and listening to God's voice. Sometimes we need to remove obstacles, and the main obstacles are, well, sin. I've found in my own spiritual life that nothing desensitizes my soul to hearing God than sin. And I've noticed, and maybe you have too, that certain sins do this more than others. Especially like venial sins, they can start to kind of wound our soul's ability to hear God. But especially when we start talking about serious or mortal sins, there is no better way to reduce our soul's capacity to hear God's voice and the intimacy of His closeness than by major stones of sin in our soul. So if we want to be more sensitive in our soul to hearing the Lord's voice, I had to do some work to remove certain obstacles. And that will only help open the doors of my soul, if you will, to hearing and to hearing much clearer the voice of God in my life. Okay, third aspect to helping us hear and how do we hear God's voice is we need to put ourselves into close proximity. Well, what does that mean? Well, think about it in the normal, ordinary life of when many people came up to Jesus in the Gospels. Sometimes there were enormous crowds. You can kind of put yourself in a crowd, like it'd be hard to hear in a crowd. So many people had to push themselves into proximity to Jesus, to hear Him, to see Him, to grab hold of Him. There's one of my favorite passages where there's the paralytic man, and he was paralyzed, so he couldn't get near to Jesus. But his 4 friends went up to the top of the roof in the house in which Jesus was staying, and they started taking off the tiles of the house, and they lowered their friend down into his presence. That's proximity. And what is that analogous to in the spiritual life? Because Jesus isn't physically walking around like that. That is always called faith. Faith will always put us into proximity to God. But there's also some practical application to faith. If I'm not seeking to draw close to Him in the Blessed Sacrament, if I'm not seeking Him in prayer, if I'm not seeking to give myself to certain sustained minutes in prayer every day, well, then I'm not really in close proximity. God can always break through any barrier, but on our end, in order on our end to hear God, am I doing the work of faith to put myself into the proximity in which to even hear God? And so that'll demand doing certain actions that authenticates, again, our faith, our real desire to start to hear God's voice. Hopefully these 3 things can help you and I to more deeply hear the voice of God and respond with a generous heart. God bless you.